Today, we'll discuss, again, we have a lot of ideas and questions that were submitted. We really appreciate that. I think that has a lot of value because then we can hopefully get some topics that will be relevant for you. One question that was submitted and related to placement in general is phosphorus fertilizer placement, specifically in wheat, some of the values with applications with the seed and some of the considerations there. So we'll share some data that we actually have from recent years on that. And then also similar to that is fertilizer placement for corn and a little bit related that to strip till as well, okay? And so we'll kind of touch those two pretty much together and also discuss a little bit some of the pros and cons. A lot of the fertilizer placement for corn was really related to starter fertilizers and what are some of the options and considerations there. Also some questions about inhibitors, especially the role of inhibitors for nitrogen in the northwest part of the state. And I think this is a very good point. There's always a lot of questions about inhibitors in general. We do hear a lot of potential benefits, but again, we have to keep in mind where we are and what are some of the real benefits in terms of return to investment. Always a question about protein and nitrogen in wheat, so we'll touch a little bit on that. And then we got a lot of questions on micronutrients and maybe some differences between different phosphorus sources. So again, we'll go through some of these, but again, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to put in the chat and we'll talk about those. Okay, so starting with phosphorus placement with the seed for wheat. This is a study we've been actually working on this the last 2-3 years. This is data from last year, 2020, 3 locations, and really to compare specifically broadcast application versus in-furrow application, okay? And so this is 40 pounds of P2O5 applied pre-plant broadcast or in-furrow with the seed. And the variable, the data that we have here is canopy cover in the spring, okay? So it's really measuring what you see here. And this is not uncommon. You see very low testing soils, and again, placement of phosphorus. And this may be not a fair comparison because we are comparing the 40 pounds in-furrow with the control. But in terms of how much canopy cover you get with the in-furrow, is pretty consistent typically, especially in low testing P. We do tend to see this much bigger early growth and canopy cover early in the season. You can see some of this in the fall and winter, but definitely a green up is something that you tend to see. And so again, this is data from last year, average of 3 locations. Now, what happened to yields? And this is really where we get a little bit into, it depends on some of the conditions. And again, keep in mind, we're talking 40 pounds here. And I separated here the locations. One of them, we have 18 part per million soil test P. So it's pretty close to the critical value of 20 part per million, which is what we want to have minimum for or critical values of phosphorus. And then I basically average the other 2 locations that have 12 and 5 part per million. And so you can look at the yields here. Obviously, we did get a response to phosphorus. So that's the value basically of the control here. Just make sure we have a response to P. But then the comparison I want to make is really the placement here. What about in-furrow versus pre-plant broadcast? And this broadcast application is not till, was not incorporated. I guess there's some level of incorporation with the drill, obviously, at planting, but it's not conventional tillage incorporated. So similar yields basically at that near optimum soil test P. On the other hand, with the lower soil test P, you really see the benefit from in-furrow in this case. We still got a benefit in terms of phosphorus applied broadcast, but much bigger yield increases with the in-furrow application. So clearly here, if we are dealing with low testing P, would be preferred to go definitely with the in-furrow application, especially also if we're putting a little bit lower rates. And the reason I say this is because we also did have 120 pounds phosphorus here in this treatment, in this study, just to see what kind of response we have. And once you have those high rates, the difference between in-furrow and broadcast tend to disappear. And again, that probably makes sense. obviously we're putting the higher rate, you kind of basically overcome the placement effect in this case. So think about those characteristics and your specific situation. Definitely salt SP level is going to be one of those key factors here. Okay, a similar study, and this average multiple locations, one of my students, Chris Weber, working on this. A lot of this is from northwest part of the state, multiple locations again. And one of the things we wanted to look at here is source, and we are comparing DAP versus MESC and different rates. And all of these, again, apply with the seed, with the drill, planting. And so we have 30 pounds, 60 pounds, rates and the two sources. Really no difference, very nice yield response to the rates of application, but no difference basically between the different P sources, okay? And so you can see here the DAP and MESC in this case, similar. Obviously we did balance the nitrogen and the sulfur component here, so we're really looking at the P only, okay? So again, we do have options here in terms of what kind of sources, and especially if we're thinking about sulfur, and we'll talk more about sulfur tomorrow. But again, that's one of the benefits, of course, with using something like MESC or 40 Rock, some of those products that already bring some sulfur in the mix. So a few key points here. Very clear increase in early growth with in-furrow, and this is one of the main things we tend to see very consistently, and sometimes this could be quite impressive in the fall and early springs. We tend to see these big differences, and again, the question is that whether that translating to yields, and as I showed you earlier, a little bit depends on the conditions, soil test levels, and so on. Definitely a yield advantage for those low testing P. Definitely I will go with in-furrow applications. If we are dealing with soil test P that is 10 part per million or lower, I think we need to be, if all possible, try to apply that phosphorus with the seed. However, again, similar yields if we are getting very close to that optimum soil test P. One thing I didn't include here, and we don't have a study specifically on this, is planting dates. But just from multiple locations that we have, something that's also become pretty consistent is that when we have late planting, we tend to see a better response with in-furrow. So in those situations, those years where we are planting wheat maybe a little bit later than our ideal planting date, I will also encourage some in-furrow application of phosphorus. And again, that makes sense. We're trying to take advantage of any growth that we can get in any tillers maybe that we can get in the late fall and early springs. And again, that placement can make a big difference in late planted wheat. When it's planted, optimum timing, optimum dates, again, that difference tends to be less consistent. Okay, so the other question we got is starter fertilizers and corn. And we do have a lot of data on these, comparing the main options that we have for starter fertilizers, which 2x2 always being kind of the default, the standard that we use over the years, but more and more Dribble behind the planter and in-furrow, of course, become more popular. We don't need to use the attachments with these options, and so this become more common. And so, so we do have a lot of data, but just quickly wanted to put kind of the pros and cons of each of these, and to keep in mind. Some of the benefits of 2x2, of course, is we can put higher volumes, including nitrogen. And I do know producers who will actually do 100% of their fertility with a planter. And of course, there's some logistics issues there if you have many acres. But it's an option, and I know some people that will do that, will put all the P, all the nitrogen with 2x2. And again, as long as we don't have any contact with the seed, that's a good alternative. But again, logistics is a big concern there. Nice response with 2x2 placement, and so that's always a good component, good point also. Now, Dribble behind the planter, also very good option for high volumes. We can also apply high rates of nitrogen if we want, pretty safe. We've done applications up to 120 pounds of nitrogen with UAN. We haven't seen any issues with damage because, again, of that separation from the seed, obviously. And in fact, I would say if we are going with the Dribble placement, it's actually better if we have higher volumes, because now is where we start to consider the issue of movement of that phosphorus maybe a little bit and combined with that nitrogen. So higher volumes will actually be better for dribble apply placement. If we have low volumes, I would rather go with in-furrow, okay? And so because it's obviously we are not putting as much, we don't worry too much about safety of the seedling in that case. And so much better will be in-furrow application if we are putting lower volumes. And again, we do have some of the other benefits with a dribble apply, no need for the attach by two attachments and similar response. With in-furrow, again, one of the key things I want to emphasize, very good option, of course, but we are limited in terms of the rates that we can apply, and we have to be really careful, especially if we're thinking about any nitrogen there is something that will not recommend UAN or urea containing fertilizers for in-furrow in corn. And so this is a quick table. I think is a good guideline to follow if we're thinking about, especially again with the seed in-furrow application. Always the question is, okay, how much fertilizer I can apply? And the factor we need to be looking at here is really nitrogen and potassium, because these are the main sources of salt. Okay, so that salt damage is really the concern with in-furrow application. So if we're talking 30-inch row spacing for corn, we need to keep that below 8 pounds total. Okay, so I usually say, in my opinion at least, I don't want to go much higher than 5 gallons of 1034O, for example, with in-furrow. That will definitely be my top for 1034O. And again, other sources, you need to watch this nitrogen and potassium combination. For wheat, of course, if you are 7 to 10-inch spacing, we can go pretty high. 25 to 30 pounds of nitrogen. And that's the reason why the data I showed you earlier, we can go pretty high with, if you're using MAP or DAP or MESC, we can go pretty high with the application rates in wheat, and usually will not be a problem. Typically, we can apply 100% of the P, and again, we don't see any problems. And like we actually, in our trials, we went pretty high just to try and test this point, and we have rates of 100, 120 pounds of P2O5 using MAP. Again, no problem in wheat. But again, in corn, because of that row spacing, obviously we are very limited there. One thing I want to emphasize, here we're talking basically no UAN or ammonium thiosulfate with the seed. So these always have to keep in mind. Okay, so strip till and placement of phosphorus in particular. Obviously, with strip till, we do have big opportunities for fertilizer application. That's one of the main things I like about strip till. Obviously, managing the residue, but also the ability of putting fertilizer and placement. This is a study we have for 10 years now, looking at a combination of broadcasts with and without starter fertilizers, and deep band with a strip till. With and without starter fertilizers, okay? So this is 80 pounds of P2O5, either, again, apply 100% with a strip till or broadcast, or split, putting some of that basically with a starter fertilizer. And the average we see of 10 years, in this case, this irrigated corn, we do tend to see a benefit here of putting some of that phosphorus with a starter fertilizer, regardless of the placement of that phosphorus. We're either doing broadcast of deep band with the strip till, putting some of that phosphorus with the starter fertilizer still in the long term provides some benefits. And again, these are the kind of things that is small enough that, 1 or 2 years, sometimes we don't see these differences, but in this case, average of 10 years, you start to see that consistently splitting that phosphorus is giving an advantage here over time, and you can pick up some of these small differences. As you can see, control in this case, about 180 bushel average of those 10 years. So again, without starter fertilizers, either deep band or broadcast, and this is with split apply starter, putting 20 pounds of that starter fertilizer at planting time. Okay, and so a key points for starter fertilizers, definitely more benefit usually in no-till systems, and there's many reasons for this. A lot of it's soil temperature, but also just the residue that we have. And once we're doing starter fertilizer, obviously we are moving away from residue, we are avoiding any potential tie-ups, and making that nutrient more available. So there are many things, many reasons why no-till can benefit more from starter fertilizers, so something to keep in mind for corn. Obviously, we can put also other nutrients, especially if we need small amounts like micros and even sulfur. So starter fertilizers give us that opportunity. And Dribble and 2x2 allow for higher rates. And again, I know many people that actually put 100% of their fertility this way, and they're pretty happy with it. But again, it's a matter of logistics. Many acres, that would be a problem. Okay, so switching to the next question we have is, what about inhibitors for nitrogen? Specifically, thinking about Western Kansas and our soils and environment there. And one thing I wanted to show is this is data from we have from the last 4 years near Manhattan, looking at N-Serve nitrification inhibitor with anhydrous. Okay. And so this 150 pounds of anhydrous, nitrogen with anhydrous, with and without nitrification inhibitors. And what we're measuring here is nitrate in the soil during the growing season, okay? So corn, we started with V2 and finish basically our black layer, and we collect sample during the growing season and look at nitrate in particular. And as you can see here, we do have a decrease in the amount of nitrate with the inhibitor, which means we are basically keeping most of that nitrogen in the ammonium more stable form. So it's doing what's supposed to do. And that's a good point to keep in mind. Now, is this translating into yields? And I'm not gonna show the data here, but basically here near Manhattan, out of 8 site years, we basically saw 2 years of yield response, okay? So 2 out of 8 years, we saw a yield benefit. Now, again, this is near Manhattan, more rain, and we're actually trying to find a sandier soil where we can potentially have some leaching problems. So what is the real risk of leaching and denitrification in Western Kansas? And I think this is the key point we need to keep in mind. And in my opinion, obviously, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's very, very unlikely that we'll have significant leaching or denitrification compared to central and eastern part of the state. So again, even here, we struggle a little bit to see a yield benefit. And so that's, in my opinion, I think there's going to be very unlikely to see benefits in our Western Kansas soils. Now, it is doing what's supposed to do, which is something that we wanted to evaluate in this case, because that's also a fair question. Some cases, some products may not necessarily be doing what's supposed to do, and that's another question as well. Now, what about volatilization? And this is a little bit different story. And so the earlier one, I was talking about nitrification inhibitor, trying to keep that nitrogen in ammonium form. But the other potential loss is volatilization, and this is really urea, right? So we're talking, this one study actually just published last year in Agronomy Journal, looking at a couple of different scenarios in this case, no-till, high residue corn, urea apply on the surface, and this is basically conventional tillage, basically no residue on the surface, and the same thing, urea on the surface, basically with and without NBPT. And NBPT is one of the most common ones is agrotane, but obviously there are many products with NBPT, basically trying to delay the process of urea hydrolysis. Okay, so we're trying to minimize that volatilization loss. And so in this case, really, we couldn't measure significant volatilization losses in this scenario of conventional tillage low residue. Now in high residue, and this was corn residue, no-till, we were able to measure close to about 20% of the nitrogen applied, basically lost by volatilization. And this is the line here is the urea only. The other line here in the bottom is using the NBPT, which is again the urease inhibitor. So that's basically doing a good job of keeping that nitrogen, that urea, from volatilizing and losing any of that nitrogen. A little bit after 2 weeks or so, we start to see some activity there. And so if you think about it, a lot of these products, NBPT, typically we say about 2 weeks is what we get from it. okay? And so again, that's essentially kind of match this data. And so what situation we may see a benefit here? Again, urea apply on top on the residue, especially not-yield heavy residue. We may see a benefit in this case, and so that would be something to consider. I think for our Western Kansas situations. And so this is dryland corn, and kind of show the similar point also. Just different sources here: anhydrous, UAN, and urea. And different combination of placement. And as long as we are putting that nitrogen, we are injecting that nitrogen, we tend to see most of the consistently higher yield advantage there. So in these situations here where we're putting that nitrogen on the residue on top, we have a combination likely of volatilization, but also maybe some significant tie-up in some cases. And obviously we do see that difference here in yields, okay? So placement is a big factor in this case. So a few key points here. Again, we have to go back to what is the real risk of leaching and denitrification for Northwest. And again, in my opinion, that's very low. And so seeing that yield benefit is always, it's gonna be always a challenge. Urea on the surface in not yield, that's one thing that I think we can see some benefit and we can get some advantage of urease inhibitors. And so something to keep in mind, especially if we have a system where we are applying urea on the broadcast on the surface. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is that urea can also be incorporated basically with irrigation or rain. I usually say about 1/4 inch of water will usually enough to incorporate that urea. And so again, if we have the ability to do that, we put it before a rain, or if we have irrigation, again, that's one way to take care of that potential issue. And obviously in that case, we will not need any urease inhibitor either. Few key points: nitrogen placement, time, and source, always going to be key factors. In many cases, and especially in Western Kansas, I think where we have more options, I will say that we can take care of most of the nitrogen loss problems if we have a combination of placement, time, and source, even without the use of inhibitors. So again, something to keep in mind. And I do see this oftentimes. Some guys may be still thinking of using inhibitors, but they're already doing an excellent job in terms of placement and time and source that typically there will not be any additional benefits. And again, we need to keep this in mind. I know there's you know, the price of grain is getting better. So we're always looking for, okay, where we can gain some extra bushels and so on. But that doesn't mean we need to spend money where it's not needed. And so something to keep in mind. Okay, so what about protein? And this is for wheat. This is a study we did a couple of years ago looking at foliar application of nitrogen, and this is about 6.5 pounds of nitrogen, so it's not very much. So we have the baseline nitrogen application rates in a top dress, and then basically come back at flag leaf emergence with the fungicide, and we apply either a UAN or a triazone, which is a type of slow release nitrogen. There are many products in the market, but essentially it's a form of urea. And so it's not very high rate of nitrogen, but we were able to measure some increase in protein content. Not very high, in most cases, usually less than 1% increase. In Belleville, we saw, again, in some cases, close to 1%, and Ashland also around 1% or less. So it's one opportunity there. We're thinking about protein and maybe boosting a little bit of protein. If we are putting fungicides already, maybe an opportunity to put a little bit of nitrogen there. But again, we have to be careful here. We're talking low rates. Like I say, in our study, we put about 6.5 pounds of nitrogen. So we go much higher than that, then we'll have problems of leaf burn. So we have to keep that low. So that's one option, one alternative. What about yields? That kind of application, we never seen any significant yield benefit. There may be a little bit of a trend here in Ashland, but not significant, and basically nothing here. Pretty good yields, though, in Belleville that year, 90 bushel wheat. So again, no increase in yield with that late application. Really, the main benefit in that case is really just the protein increase. So it is a much complex, and again, we can have a full webinar just on protein and nitrogen. But the first step is really we need to meet the demands of nitrogen for the yield potential. And this is one thing I want to emphasize. And keeping in mind fertilizer rates and what we have in the soil, we have to put enough nitrogen for the yield potential. That's always the first step. And then the time of nitrogen can help a lot. And we're talking split applications, late applications, even foliar application with fungicides. We see some benefit there. A lot of time those may not necessarily give you additional yields, though. We're really talking just a little bit of an increase in terms of protein in that case. So if we want to keep high yields and high protein, it's really more intensive management, and that's been always the case. But again, the first step is really making sure and putting enough nitrogen. And this is a little bit of a challenge. You know, we always talk about, I hear often people say, you know, wheat is not very efficient. We don't see the level of nitrogen use efficiency like corn. And in many ways, that's not very fair, in my opinion, because we're also asking for high protein, and protein is nitrogen. In the case of corn, obviously, we can have very high nitrogen use efficiency because we don't care about nitrogen in the grain. Okay, so keep that in mind also. Oftentimes I think we kind of forget about that, and we think that wheat is not very efficient in terms of nitrogen. Okay, so quickly here, one of the questions in the poll here, I'll put it in the chat. Let's see if you can switch and finish here with basically with finish with micronutrients. And if you don't have the link, I'll just put it there in the chat again for you. Okay, so there's a lot of questions about micronutrients, and again, like I mentioned, there's more maybe interest a little bit now with grain prices are getting a little bit better, and we're trying to capture the last bushel, if you will. And so I wanted to get a little bit of feedback of this group. What are you guys using? Is something that you are considering at all? And so very good. I see zinc, definitely the most popular. See quite a bit of iron and chloride. And we're not talking about iron today specifically. I know for many of you, obviously, iron chlorosis is a big factor. Okay, we did a presentation on this on Cover Your Acres, but we're not going to talk about that today. That's a huge factor in many soils. See quite a bit chloride as well. No micronutrients. I see some of you also including copper, boron, manganese. Very good. Excellent. Okay, very good. Again, just give a little bit of an idea to the entire group what everybody else is doing and what you are considering for micros. And definitely I see zinc being the most popular here. And so we'll start with zinc. We've done some work in the last few years looking at specifically corn, zinc in corn. And I would say the most responsive crop to zinc typically is going to be corn. We do see also some benefit in sorghum, but then other crops really not much. We done in winter wheat, in soybeans, and we don't see the level of response. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, this is broadcast application we did in very low testing. Okay, 0.3 part per million soil test zinc. One of the things about zinc also is that the soil test worked pretty well. Okay, I would say about the only one from the micronutrients that really works well, very comparable to what you will see in phosphorus, for example, in terms of how it works. And so we see in this broadcast application, pretty good response is irrigated corn, low testing zinc, good response even to very high rates. And in many cases, we do need to apply these kind of rates for zinc, especially if we're trying to build up soil tests, okay? And so usually that relationship is with about 10 pounds of zinc will increase soil tests for close to about 1 part per million, okay? So in this case, with these 10 pounds of zinc, we're basically taking care of this low testing zinc problem. Starter fertilizers, and again, going back to starters, this is one opportunity where you can, again, take advantage of if you already have a starter fertilizer program, including zinc in that. NPK plus zinc, we've seen some good response. Again, very low testing situations where you'll tend to see a yield response in corn. Okay, so we're talking low testing in corn, which is going to be your more sensitive crop to zinc response. So other crops, I'll typically will not, based on our data, I will not apply zinc, especially to wheat and soybeans. A critical value is 1 part per million. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind. And we tend to see from our data at least more consistent benefit when you get to about 0.7, 0.8 and lower is you start to see more consistent yield benefits. Again, this is across 8 locations. A lot of these actually were in the Northwest, something that we did with Jeannie and others a few years ago already. We look at multiple micronutrients. We couldn't really see any significant yield increases to micronutrients. And I'm not including, in this case, chloride, okay? So chloride is maybe a little bit different situation, especially if you are closer to central and north central part of the state. Chloride will be a separate nutrient pretty much. But then you're looking at copper, zinc, boron, mixes, maybe a little bit from, I would say sulfur maybe is one that maybe was showing a little bit something here. That's also came with a mix, but other micros, basically nothing in those soils. And again, just want to emphasize chloride is one of the key ones there. What about chloride for dryland corn? We've done this for multiple locations, a lot of it mostly in the central, north central part of the state. And this is where there's a point there as you go west. And I would say, if I have to put a line somewhere, I would say, you know, Wakini, 283 and west is very, at least based on the data we have, probably less likely to see a chloride response. And I'm talking dry land. Irrigated would probably be a different situation. But now as we go east, in central part of the state where we tend to see most of that consistent benefit to chloride for corn, sorghum, and obviously for wheat as well. Okay, so potential yield benefits from micros, definitely zinc, and I see many of you are including zinc as part of your fertility program. I think that's something that I will watch for very closely. So thinking about return to investment, that would be the first one. Iron chlorosis, and this again is kind of a separate category pretty much, but definitely for there's opportunities for sorghum and soybeans for those of you who have issues with iron chlorosis in some of your fields. And then chloride is another one that I will watch very closely also. Secondary nutrient sulfur, we'll talk about that more tomorrow, but also something that is becoming more relevant as we go. Foliar application of micros, and again, this is something we've done a lot of work with foliar applications, and we see very, very limited yield benefits typically with micros and in foliar applications. If I will do micronutrients applications, I think with the starter fertilizer is probably the most efficient option. That's where we tend to see the most consistent benefit if it's needed. And of course, again, going back to the basics, and this is something I just want to emphasize, because again, we are getting a little bit in maybe looking at, okay, how we can maximize yields, but sometimes we tend to forget about the basics. It's not uncommon. I'll talk to people asking for micronutrients and asking about phosphorus levels or pH. They may not be taking care of those. So those are the low-hanging fruits. We have to be taking care of those first before we go to the micros, which typically will tend to be smaller yield increases. Okay, we also have a question about phosphorus sources, and we'll finish with this here. One thing just often come back is what about the different sources, ortho versus polyphosphates, and just one table here to show that basically in 24 hours after application to the soil, if we have a temperature of about 60 to 70 degrees, more than half of that phosphorus basically hydrolyzed to orthophosphate. So in other words, typically will not make a big difference once you apply and once the crop is going to take up. And that's basically the take-home message here. Liquid and dry sources, kind of similar situation. Really no difference, at least in our soils. And I want to emphasize this because, you know, we see a lot of other information and there are some situations where there could be a difference. And I'm talking very high calcium carbonate, like Australia. I've seen some of those in like in Twitter and other places. And we have to be careful. In Kansas, all the research I seen, we don't have any agronomic difference between different sources. And so it really goes back to soil test level, placement, Those are things that we need to keep in mind. And ultimately, again, what's more convenient for your operation? Okay, are you set up to do more of a dry fertilizer application, or liquid works better? And obviously the economics. So I think since we have that similar response to dry and liquids, it's really a matter of what's convenient for us. So with that, I'll stop there and see what questions we have. I think.
Okay, yeah, it's time for questions now. So it looks like we have a few questions coming in. I'll start with one on YouTube, and then we'll go to the question and answer box, the questions that came in as well. I am Sandra Wick. I am the Post Rock Extension District Crop Production Agent. All righty, first question, Dorivar. Is it common to use mycorrhizal fungi inoculation to improve nitrogen uptake in some of these areas?
Yes, that's a very good question. In terms of, there's a lot more emphasis also on mycorrhiza, and there's some potential there. I think that the research still very, we actually do have some study right now in the field for nitrogen, and I think there are some trends, but still very early in my opinion. I think there's going to be potential. A lot of it that could be primarily, if we talk about mycorrhiza, is really primarily for phosphorus, so we can see maybe more benefit there. In terms of nitrogen, there's also a lot of potential for nitrogen fixing bacteria and options that is becoming more popular, and there's potential there. Again, in my opinion, still a lot of these are very early. Unfortunately, a lot of the products that is out there maybe goes too fast to commercial before we even get some of the data to support. Also, the other thing, the benefit tend to be very small usually. So we'll not expect to see huge benefits. Is typically maybe a one way to increase efficiency and really small increases. But again, especially low testing situations for phosphorus, we still need to apply the nitrogen, the fertilizer that's needed.
Alrighty, I'll pass it on to the Zoom monitor. That would be Craig. Craig, it looks like you had several questions that came in.
Yes, Lisa, I'm Craig Dinkle from the Midway District. Let's go to here first. How important is it to use a nitrogen stabilizer using 28 or 32% on top dress wheat this time of year? I always taught ammonium nitrate products do not, I think that's supposed to be, I always thought ammonium nitrate products do not denitrify. I would think it would be a must on 46 urea.
That's an excellent point, and I'm glad that you asked that question, because UAN is only 50% urea. And so right there we're basically cutting the potential for volatilization in half. And so the data that I show you, volatilization, we can get worst case scenario up to 20%, but that's urea. So that's 100% urea. So if we're thinking about UAN, just by switching the source right there, we are cutting that essentially in half. And then of course, if we are using streamer bars or we're dribbling that UAN, we're also moving that urea much into the soil, in contact with the soil, and the potential is much lower. So I will definitely agree with that. I think the potential for volatilization is much lower with UAN compared to dry urea. And so I at that point, I don't think it's really worth in terms of the potential losses that we can see with UAN.
Alrighty, next one here. In late planned wheat, at what soil test level would you expect to no longer see a yield response to 1034 in furrow? What soil test level for no yield response at optimal planting time?
Yes, and we do have part of the studies, we are looking at those critical values. And there's two things here. We actually did look at early growth and canopy cover, and that critical value, that visual difference. We still see it pretty easily to 25, 30 part per million soil test P. However, once you get to that level, that yield response is not necessarily there. And so we have to try and separate that, basically the effect of the early growth and what you can see in terms of yields. And so 20 part per million still coming back kind of the critical value for yields. So anything below 20 part per million we tend to see consistent yield benefits. Once you get higher than 20 part per million, and I would say in that range of 20 to 30, that's where we tend to see a lot of that visual differences oftentimes that may not translate into yields. Now the late planted component, that's one thing that's a little bit more tricky, because I would say with late planted wheat, we can probably still see a yield response 25, even close to 30 part per million. And so that's what this makes a little bit more complicated, because again, that planting time, I think this is a real factor here. And again, goes back to trying to put tillers and anything that we can gain basically in the fall and early spring is going to be beneficial in that case.
All right. I'll stay with the wheat questions here. For the addition of nitrogen at fungicide timing, you mentioned going at the flag leaf stage. Is there any work done at the heading timing? And any thoughts of if that would work also for protein increase?
Yes, that's a good question, and I will. Some of the locations we have was actually getting close to heading, and so I think we have a window there. I don't know. I wouldn't go too late though. I think that's the question is that if we're going too late after heading, I think obviously we're not going to get any of that nitrogen benefit anymore. So there's a window there, I think, around flag leaf and then heading around that timing, I think is probably would be ideal. And again, especially if we were trying to combine with fungicides. And I think that's really the key. I will not go and apply foliar nitrogen, without, if you're not already doing another pass for fungicide. So the advantage of that is that if you are already doing fungicide, well, maybe you can take advantage of that and put some nitrogen there. But just for the nitrogen, I think it will be tough to pay for that.
Got a couple more here. With zinc in corn, would you see a similar yield response with a 0.3 part per million critical level in dryland 100 bushel acre corn environment?
Yes, and it's really more of a factor of the soil test zinc in this case. So even in dry land, I think with those very low testing low testing zinc, I will expect to see a yield response. Obviously, the magnitude of the yield response will be smaller because of the yield potential is smaller, but I will still expect to see a yield response there with very low testing zinc.
All right, and another one here. Thinking of streaming on liquid on the surface for milo because it's cheaper to use liquid now versus dry. How much tie up will I get in the residue? The residue is wheat stubble and milo stubble, and should he consider using a stabilizer?
Yes, that's a good point, and this goes back to the placement aspect. Basically, if we are using streamer bars, that's always going to be a big improvement. So with this heavy residue, the one thing we don't want to do is broadcast that on that residue. There's going to be quite a bit of tie up on wheat and sorghum residue, and so kind of if we go in terms of the worst to best, using streamer bars will be kind of intermediate. Worst case will be broadcasting, and best case will be to injecting that UAN. So if we have a way to inject that and put it in contact with the soil, that will be the best case scenario. Of course, we'll minimize any potential tie-up. Now, the additives is not necessarily going to make a big difference in this case if we're thinking about the tie-up only, because the additives, basically the inhibitor is going to minimize volatilization. But in this heavy residue situation, the tie-up could be one of the main problems. And so it's really two factors here, the tie-up and the volatilization. So even though we take care of the volatilization losses, we still may have some tie-up problems. So again, it is a good placement using streaming. I think I really like it. I think it's already take care of a lot of the issues, but the next step will be obviously injecting that UAN.
All right, got one last one that came in. By placing nitrogen and phosphorus in 7 to 8 inch rows, you can deliver more total nutrient per acre rather than a big amount in 30 inch rows. Is that correct?
Yes, and this going to the point of putting fertilizer with the seed and safety of that seedling. And so if we have narrow row spacing like in wheat, of course, we have more basically space to put that nitrogen or that fertilizer in general. So basically diluting the amount of fertilizer that we have for each lineal foot, basically, of row. And so that's basically the point here. So going back to that table, again, if we have a narrow row spacing for wheat, we can go pretty high with the rates. In most cases, you don't see any problem really, even meeting the phosphorus requirement. Now for corn, it's a little bit more of a challenge just because we are dealing with 30-inch row spacings.
Okay, is there any more questions for Dorivar? We have a few minutes left here. If you have anything else, please put it in the Q&A box or put it in the comments box on YouTube. We'll get those onto Dorivar here. We'll switch gears here just a little bit. If there's any other questions coming in, we'll bring them back to Dorivar. So thanks, Dorivar, for kind of running through a lot of topics in pretty rapid succession here for this session. So what we're going to do here okay, so thanks everybody for participating in our virtual crop talk series here. One thing we're going to ask you to do is to complete the evaluation. Stacy, do you want to talk about that real quick? Sorry, I kind of threw him under the bus here and put him on the spot. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and move forward. So one thing we're asking you guys to do is just give us just a little bit of feedback on this format, how you felt like this session went. It's a really quick, like a 3-question survey at the end of this. Somebody's gonna put this link in the chat box. You can just click on that link. It'll take you right over to the evaluation document. One other thing that it will ask you is just for a little bit of demographics. We're not trying to be nosy. We're getting some feedback from the state and from federal funding that we need to get a better handle on who our audiences are. So there's going to be just a little bit of information on who you are that attended this webinar session. So if you would complete that evaluation, we'd really appreciate that. Dorivar, were there any final comments that you wanted to have as part of your presentation?
No, Jeannie, I think I will just want to mention the topics for tomorrow. And again, we just one way to split some of all the questions we got. Tomorrow we'll talk more about timing of soil samples and what are some of the key considerations there. We'll focus more on sorghum fertility as well. We'll spend a little bit more time on that. What are some of the key things we need to think about for higher yield sorghum? We'll also spend more time on pH and liming. There's quite a bit of questions, especially as we go north central and central part of the state, and maybe what other benefits of pH, maintaining pH, and also spend more time on sulfur management. And again, that's becoming more of an issue, especially again in the central part of the state. So we do have quite a bit of data on sulfur from the last couple of years. So we'll spend time on that tomorrow. Those are the questions we got, and we split it that way. I guess we'll also touch a little bit on potassium, high testing K, and the needs maybe for potassium. We do have some studies there in Scandia where we're looking at that particular point. And so we'll share some of that tomorrow as well.
Okay, thank you, Dorivar. I'm excited to hear tomorrow's presentation also. So, okay, so if you guys would go in and complete the evaluation for us, really, it's not going to take much time to just go in and click a few boxes. Just give us some basic feedback on this session. And I think with that, we are at the end of our time. Stacy, did you have anything to add?
No, I didn't. There was just a question that came in, any CCA credits. It just came in on the chat box. And then don't forget, yeah, we've got these series going on through the rest of February on Tuesdays and a few Wednesdays into March the 9th. So plan to join us some more if you could.
That's correct. If you are needing CCA credits, please email me. I had you email me at the beginning of the presentation. Go ahead and email me again so that you're checking out of this presentation. We'll put my email address in the chat box. It's just jfalkjones@ksu.edu, but we'll make sure that that gets into the chat box. So if you need CCA credits, please email me back on that. And I think we are done for the day. So hopefully we're right on schedule here. Oh, right at 11:30. Awesome. Okay. Yes, that's perfect. So, okay. Thanks guys for joining us. Please let us know if you have any questions, any feedback. Hopefully we'll get a little better at this as we move through this webinar series, but for our first one, hopefully it didn't go too bad. So thanks guys for joining, and hopefully we'll see you as we do this Crop Talk webinar series.